Jimel's dad, Marcus, had always taught his son to be strong, but hearing what happened in that classroom filled him with a quiet anger. He couldn't just let this slide. He knew too well what it felt like to be judged unfairly, and he refused to let his son go through the same thing. That night, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, replaying Jamal's words in his mind. How long had this been going on? How many other kids had suffered in silence? The next morning, Marcus didn't just drop Jamal off at school. He walked right inside. The other parents and teachers turned their heads as he passed. He wasn't loud, he wasn't aggressive, but there was something in his eyes that made people take notice. He asked to speak with the principal. What he said behind those closed doors would soon have the entire school talking, and no one saw it coming. Inside the principal's office, Marcus sat across from Principal Reynolds, his expression calm but firm. He laid out everything Jamal had told him: the insults, the humiliation, the way Mr. Daniels had been treating his son differently. Principal Reynolds listened, his fingers tapping lightly against his desk. He sighed and leaned forward. "Mr. Carter, I understand your concerns, but are you sure this isn't just a misunderstanding?" Marcus clenched his jaw. A misunderstanding? His son had come home feeling small, questioning himself, and this was the response. He took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "I'm not here for excuses. I'm here for answers," he said firmly. Meanwhile, in the classroom, Jamal sat at his desk, his stomach in knots. Mr. Daniels barely acknowledged him today, but the tension was thick. The other students whispered, stealing glances at him. He knew something was about to happen. He just didn't know what. Marcus refused to back down. "If this were your child, would you call it a misunderstanding?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Principal Reynolds hesitated, shifting in his chair. The tension in the room was thick. Before he could respond, a soft knock on the door interrupted them. A staff member peeked in, looking uneasy. "Mr. Daniels is asking to speak with you," she said, glancing at Marcus. Back in the classroom, Jamal's heart raced as his teacher left the room. The whispers grew louder. He could feel eyes on him, but he kept staring at his desk, trying to ignore the knots in his stomach. What was happening? Did his dad know everything? What if speaking up only made things worse? Meanwhile, in the hallway, Marcus locked eyes with Mr. Daniels for the first time. The teacher's face was unreadable, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of recognition, maybe even fear. Mr. Daniels hesitated for just a second, but Marcus caught it. That flicker of something, guilt, fear, recognition. It was gone just as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a forced confidence. "Mr. Carter," he said, folding his arms. "I assume you're here because of Jamal." Marcus didn't blink. That's right. His voice was steady, but inside, his patience was running thin. Principal Reynolds cleared his throat. "Mr. Daniels, we need to discuss the concerns brought forward." Daniels let out a small, almost amused chuckle. Concerns? With all due respect, some students just have a harder time adjusting. Maybe if Jamal put in more effort. Marcus cut him off. Effort. His voice remained calm, but the air in the room shifted. "My son comes home every day wondering why he's treated differently. He's afraid to speak up because he knows what happens when he does." Before the teacher could respond, another knock came at the door. A woman stepped in, another parent, her face tight with frustration. "I heard what's going on," she said, her voice firm. "And I have something to add." The room fell silent as the woman stepped forward, her eyes locked on Mr. Daniels. "You're not going to dismiss this like it's nothing," she said, "because my son has been through the same thing." Marcus turned to her, surprised. "Your son?" She nodded. "For months, he's been coming home upset, saying he's being treated unfairly. I didn't want to believe it at first. I told him to keep his head down and work hard. But now I see it wasn't just him. Principal Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Daniels opened his mouth to speak, but she wasn't finished. And it's not just Jamal. I've talked to other parents. We all see the pattern. The weight of her words hung in the air. Mr. Daniels' face went pale. For the first time, he had nothing to say. Then the door opened again. This time, it was a student. A quiet, nervous boy from Jamal's class. He swallowed hard, looking at the adults in the room. "Hi, I need to say something," he stammered. Marcus and the other parent exchanged glances. This wasn't just about Jamal anymore. The truth was bigger than anyone realized. The room was still as the boy took a deep breath. "Mr. Daniels does this all the time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He picks on certain kids. He makes them feel like they don't belong." Principal Reynolds leaned back, his expression unreadable. But Marcus could see it, the weight of everything finally sinking in. More voices were coming forward. This wasn't just about one incident. It was a pattern, and now there was no denying it. Mr. Daniels looked around, realizing he had lost control of the situation. His excuses wouldn't work anymore. The principal cleared his throat. "I think we need to have a serious discussion about Mr. Daniels' conduct." Jamal, sitting outside the office, saw his father step out. Marcus met his son's eyes and gave him a reassuring nod. The fight wasn't over, but change had begun. And this time, Jamal knew he wasn't alone. It started like any other school day, but for young Jamal, things were about to take a turn he never expected. Sitting quietly in his classroom, he had grown used to the cold stares and unfair treatment from his teacher, Mr. Daniels. But today was different. Today, the insults weren't just subtle. They were loud enough for everyone to hear. The class fell silent as Mr. Daniels singled Jamal out, mocking him in front of his classmates. His heart pounded, his hands clenched under the desk. Why was he always the target? Jamal's friends looked away, too afraid to speak up. But when he got home and told his dad what happened, everything changed. His father, a man of quiet strength, listened carefully. And then he took action. What he did next didn't just stand up for his son. It left the entire school in absolute shock.